Today on Star Talk, we are going over one of the most talked about moments in recent late-night history. A confrontation that left viewers replaying clips and questioning what really happened between a talk show host and his celebrity guest. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below where you are watching from. Are you watching from your living room, an office, or somewhere else? Tonight's episode featured a tense exchange between Jimmy Kimmel and Joaquin Phoenix, a moment that would become impossible to ignore. How did a routine late-night interview spiral into a heated clash? Why did the conversation touch on a topic long considered sensitive? The night began, like any other on Jimmy Kimmel Live, with the familiar energy of the studio and Jimmy leaning into his opening monologue. But there was something different tonight, an invisible tension hovering just beneath the surface. Joaquin Phoenix, known for his intensity and enigmatic presence, took his seat with quiet poise, as if he were prepared for more than the usual playful banter. Yet what would unfold was far from ordinary. At the center of the tension was a film project that had left Hollywood buzzing for years. Joaquin had been attached to Todd Haynes' 1930s romance film, De Noche, a project he had helped develop. He had poured energy into shaping the story, only to leave abruptly, just 5 days before filming was set to begin. No public explanation was ever given, causing the production to collapse temporarily. Though the project was later revived with Pedro Pascal replacing him as the lead alongside Danny Ramirez. The wound in Hollywood circles remained fresh. Could a conversation on a talk show decades later reopen those old scars? Would Jimmy Kimmel touch a nerve that had long been avoided? As cameras rolled and the bright desk gleamed under the lights, Joaquin shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes reflecting the weight of what he carried: commitment, collaboration, and frustration. Jimmy's opening question, though lighthearted on the surface, hinted at the past departure. "So, Joaquin," Jimmy began, leaning forward, "you were involved in a project that didn't quite make it to the screen. Care to tell us why?" The audience chuckled politely, unaware of the tension simmering beneath Joaquin's calm exterior. It was a question that could have been brushed off, but the seconds stretched as Joaquin's gaze hardened and his jaw tightened. How do you confront years of speculation, rumors, and public curiosity? Can a single question ignite a chain reaction, transforming a simple interview into an unforgettable spectacle? The energy in the studio shifted, moving from casual entertainment to something charged, something revealing. In that suspended moment, between Jimmy's careful words and Joaquin's measured silence, the stage was set for the confrontation that would define the night. What happens when decades of unresolved frustration collide on a late-night stage? How does a polite conversation escalate into a scene that leaves viewers stunned? These questions set the scene for a story of raw human emotion, of tension that cannot be ignored, and of a moment that would be replayed for weeks afterward. So stay with us and watch closely. From subtle gestures to explosive turning points, from polite exchanges to undeniable confrontation, this story shows how even in the controlled environment of a talk show, emotions can erupt, leaving a lasting mark on everyone in the room. Are you ready to see what happens when a host's words brush against the unresolved past of a world-renowned actor? Let's dive in, moment by moment. The question hung in the air, subtle yet sharp, as if slicing through the carefully maintained composure of the studio. The audience laughed lightly at Jimmy's remark, thinking it harmless. But for Joaquin Phoenix, it was a spark. Every detail of the studio, the warm glow of the lights, the polished red desk, the murmurs of the crowd faded into the background as his mind replayed the months he had devoted to De Noche. Those late nights of script revisions, storyboarding scenes with meticulous care, casting discussions, location scouting, all rendered irrelevant by an abrupt public narrative that had never given him the chance to explain. Could one casual question really pierce through years of careful silence? It had. Jimmy, sensing the shift in energy, but never one to back down, leaned forward slightly. His voice, light and teasing, cut through the charged air. "So, people still wonder why you left, Joaquin. Care to finally tell them?" The words, though meant as playful prodding, carried an edge that suggested accusation. It was one of those lines that on any other night might have earned a witty retort, a soft laugh, a shrug. But tonight, the undercurrent of unresolved frustration was palpable. Joaquin's eyes flicked toward the host, a momentary narrowing that said more than words ever could. The audience felt it too, a tension so subtle yet electric that the laughter died before it could fully form. He remembered the sudden chaos that followed his exit from De Noche, a production halted, crew scrambling, Pedro Pascal eventually stepping in, all while the whispers and rumors began to coil in the press. The public had been left with the story they had constructed themselves. A story that placed blame without explanation. A story that had followed him for years. And now, decades later, here it was, resurfacing in the most unlikely of places. A late-night talk show where smiles were expected, where a sense of lighthearted banter was the norm. How had it come to this? that an innocuous stage could become a crucible for long-buried resentment. The air in the studio grew heavier with every second. Jimmy, still smiling on the surface, was feeling the shift too. This was no longer a simple conversation about a past project. It had transformed into a silent reckoning. One could almost hear the dialogue that wasn't spoken, a clash of professional obligation versus personal frustration. Joaquin's posture changed subtly. He leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, a defensive but commanding gesture, signaling the audience, and the host alike, that this was no longer playful territory. How do you respond when your past work, your intentions, and your dedication are questioned in front of millions, with a casualness that feels like judgment? Then came the line that escalated the room in ways no one expected. A member of the production crew, trying to lighten the tension, muttered something under their breath about how maybe he's just too difficult to work with. A comment meant in jest, but laced with the sting of truth and the weight of judgment. The words, though not directed aloud at him, cut like a knife. Joaquin's gaze snapped to the speaker, and the room felt it, the subtle intake of breath from the audience. The small, uneasy shifts of the crew. The energy in the studio had transformed from quiet unease to charged anticipation. What would he say? Would he walk away silently, maintain decorum, or let the storm inside him break? He rose, slowly but deliberately, the red light reflecting off the polished desk as if highlighting every line of tension in his face. Jimmy, still smiling, leaned forward, unaware that he had reached the point where the casual charm of his questioning could no longer contain the force that Joaquin carried. The audience sat frozen, waiting, sensing that something remarkable and unpredictable was about to unfold. The stage, designed for entertainment and laughter, had shifted into a space where raw human emotion could no longer be masked by jokes or applause. Every eye in the studio was fixed on the moment that would become the defining incident of the night. And then, in the silence that followed, Joaquin leaned forward and spoke, his voice low, steady, but unmistakably commanding. The words themselves were minimal, yet they carried the weight of years, of expectation, of frustration denied and misinterpreted. The studio lights glinted off his eyes, reflecting an intensity that made even the confident host pause. What followed would not only embarrass Jimmy in front of a live audience, but would also redefine the public perception of Joaquin Phoenix, showing him not just as a performer, but as a man unwilling to let mischaracterizations go unchallenged. Joaquin's words, few as they were, carried a resonance that filled the studio, bending the air with weight and authority. Jimmy's smile faltered, just slightly, a subtle crack in the confidence that late-night hosts cultivate so carefully. The audience, sensing the shift, leaned forward in their seats, captivated by the gravity of a moment that had begun as casual banter and now teetered on the edge of confrontation. How had a question about a film from years ago turned into such an electrifying spectacle? And yet, anyone familiar with Joaquin Phoenix's reputation knew the answer. He did not tolerate misrepresentation lightly, nor did he allow assumptions about his choices or intentions to go unchallenged. The mention of Denosia, which had been dormant in the public eye for so long, had unlocked a door to a memory still raw. Joaquin recalled the countless hours he had dedicated to the project, the scripts that he had reworked with meticulous care, the production meetings where he had advocated fiercely for the story's emotional depth, and the sudden collapse that left him with no explanation from the studio as to why he had been forced out. All of that investment, all of that creative passion, now being lightly referenced on a stage designed for entertainment. Could anyone blame him for the flicker of frustration that tightened his jaw and sharpened his gaze? Jimmy, noticing the change, attempted to steer the conversation lightly back into familiar territory, but his words inadvertently brushed too close to the sensitive core. "You've left projects before, Joaquin," he said with a chuckle, "so people are curious why some things didn't pan out." A subtle murmur of laughter rippled through the audience. But for Joaquin, the tone of the remark, light-hearted as it was, felt dismissive. It implied a lack of seriousness, a trivialization of years of work, and a framing of his choices as whimsical rather than deliberate. Could a host, even one as practiced and charming as Jimmy Kimmel, unintentionally provoke the very response the audience had been waiting for without realizing it? The energy in the studio became almost tangible, charged with expectation. Joaquin's posture shifted. He leaned forward, arms resting lightly on his knees, eyes fixed intently on Jimmy. Every subtle gesture, the slight tilt of his head, the way he exhaled, the tightening of his fingers signaled to the audience that something pivotal was about to occur. He was weighing every word, every movement, knowing that this was a stage where appearances mattered, yet also feeling the urge to reclaim the narrative for himself, to assert control over the conversation that had danced too close to mischaracterization. Then came the final provocation, almost incidental, yet unmistakably sharp. A member of the production, in an effort to lighten the atmosphere, quipped under their breath about how maybe the big star just can't handle criticism. The words were meant to be peripheral, unnoticed by the audience, But they reached Joaquin instantly. His eyes narrowed slightly, and the weight of everything, the years of speculation, the abrupt departure from Denosi, the whispers that had followed him coalesced into a moment that demanded response. It was the trigger, the small but critical spark, that transformed tension into confrontation. He rose from his chair, deliberate but controlled, the studio lights reflecting off the polished desk as if illuminating each line of determination in his face. The audience remained silent, captivated by the raw energy in the room. Jimmy, caught mid-sentence, realized only in that moment that he had underestimated the intensity of the emotion sitting across from him. The casual banter of late-night television had vanished, replaced by a palpable human drama. Unfolding live before dozens of cameras and hundreds of eyes in the audience, Joaquin's voice, when it finally emerged, was measured but firm, resonant with authority and emotion. He did not shout, he did not over-explain, yet every word cut through the air with clarity. The few words he chose were deliberate, a reclaiming of agency and dignity in the face of assumptions, subtly exposing the casual dismissal he had endured while maintaining control of the moment. The host, confident as he was, paused, realizing that he had been outmaneuvered, not through aggression, but through presence, intention, and calm command. The audience sensed it, leaning in closer, caught in the gravity of an unexpected, triumphant turn. By the end of the moment, Joaquin had not only responded to the provocation, but had done so in a way that left Jimmy Kimmel momentarily embarrassed, his charm insufficient to mask the reality of having misjudged his guest. The live studio, designed to entertain, had transformed into a stage where years of misunderstanding and unresolved tension were addressed in a single, compelling sequence. What began as a casual question about a decades-old film had become an unforgettable spectacle of human emotion, intellect, and self-possession, and the audience knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. The studio was silent for a heartbeat, the kind of pause that stretches impossibly long, where every eye was fixed on Joaquin Phoenix. He remained standing for a moment, allowing the weight of his presence to fill the space. Jimmy, accustomed to guiding the flow of conversation, leaned back slightly, a hint of surprise flickering across his face. The audience sensed the shift from playful banter to raw confrontation, their murmurs dying in anticipation, unable to look away. This was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning, a moment where years of speculation and unspoken frustration were playing out before a live audience, each gesture and glance amplified under the unforgiving stage lights. Joaquin's mind briefly flashed to the weeks leading up to his departure from Denosi, the tension between creative vision and studio pressures, the endless debates over casting, tone, and authenticity. Those 5 days before filming had been the culmination of frustration, artistic compromise, and personal boundaries. He had walked away to preserve the integrity of the story he had helped create. Yet decades later, the casual framing of his choices by an audience and a host he respected felt almost dismissive. Could anyone truly understand what it meant to step away from something you had nurtured only to see the narrative rewritten by the public? That was the unspoken question that lingered in the room, heavy and suffocating. Jimmy, trying to recover, attempted a lighter approach, a tactic he often used to diffuse tension. "I mean, Joaquin, some people say walking away is part of being a star. Others might call it difficult." His words, meant to tease, landed differently than intended. For a fleeting second, the audience chuckled politely, but the sound was awkward, hollow against the building intensity. Joaquin's expression, previously restrained, hardened subtly, signaling that he would not allow misrepresentation to pass lightly. He leaned slightly forward, eyes meeting Jimmy's directly, the kind of stare that demands attention without a single word spoken. Every member of the crew shifted, sensing that the controlled environment they had rehearsed for months had transformed into something unpredictable. The tension escalated further when a camera operator, attempting to redirect attention, muttered something meant as humor about maybe the drama belongs on screen instead of off. Joaquin caught it immediately, a flicker of amusement passing across his features before hardening into determination. The comment, though innocuous to some, struck a chord. It implied that his frustration was performative, trivial, and overlooked the weight of his prior commitment to his craft. That slight, that dismissal, was all it took. The room felt it. This was the moment when restraint would meet the inevitable eruption of truth. And then, with deliberate clarity, Joaquin spoke. His words were minimal, but commanding, each syllable deliberate, cutting through the air. "I'm leaving," he said. Just those 2 words, simple, yet full of resonance, captured years of tension, frustration, and control. The audience gasped, subtly. The studio fell into a stunned silence. And even Jimmy's practiced composure faltered for a fraction of a second. The phrase was more than a statement. It was a reclaiming of narrative, a subtle indictment of assumptions made, a declaration that his choices, long speculated upon, were his own and not open to casual judgment. The effect was immediate. Jimmy, momentarily disarmed, attempted a laugh, but it lacked its usual confidence, replaced instead by the recognition that he had been caught off guard. The audience, sensing the gravity, leaned forward as if drawn in by some magnetic force, witnessing a dynamic shift that would become the defining moment of the episode. The host's control, carefully cultivated over countless interviews, had been challenged, and the guest, Joaquin Phoenix, had achieved a quiet, yet undeniable triumph in that tension-filled space. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every micro-expression, every subtle gesture that told a story beyond words. Joaquin's stance, composed yet assertive, communicated more than dialogue ever could. Jimmy's pause, a fraction too long, revealed an unspoken acknowledgement of the power Joaquin wielded simply by maintaining his poise. The audience felt it viscerally. A confrontation that had been building for years had reached its apex, not through shouting or spectacle, but through presence, conviction, and an unshakable command of one's own narrative. By the time Joaquin finally sat, the room had transformed. The studio lights, once warm and inviting, seemed to emphasize the gravity of the encounter, reflecting off the polished surfaces like a spotlight on raw human emotion. Jimmy recovered, attempting to steer the conversation forward, but the energy had shifted irrevocably. What had begun as a casual late-night exchange had turned into a study of tension, control, and the power of quietly asserting oneself against assumptions. Assumptions made by the public, by the media, and by those in positions of influence. The audience left that night, not just entertained, but profoundly engaged. They had witnessed the reclaiming of a story, the assertion of personal truth, and the undeniable impact of standing firm in the face of subtle provocation. Joaquin Phoenix had transformed a seemingly ordinary interview into a landmark moment of human drama, one that would be analyzed, discussed, and remembered for years to come. The studio was thick with tension after Joaquin's declaration. "I'm leaving" had hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through every corner of the set. For a moment, the audience seemed suspended in disbelief, unsure whether the actor would follow through or if the host would regain control. Cameras panned across the faces in the crowd, capturing the mix of shock, fascination, and quiet anticipation. Even the crew, accustomed to the unpredictability of live television, felt a subtle tremor of unease. This was no ordinary interview. The moment had transformed into a live study of power, presence, and emotional truth. Jimmy Kimmel, a seasoned host who had guided countless conversations with humor and charm, attempted to fill the silence with a quip, a last-ditch effort to regain footing. "Well, I guess we've found the dramatic side of Hollywood," he said, voice attempting levity. But the words felt hollow, failing to penetrate the aura Joaquin had created. He had not stormed off, yet his stance, the controlled intensity in his gaze, and the slight narrowing of his eyes communicated a quiet authority that no amount of charm could overshadow. The audience, sensing the subtle humiliation, leaned forward even more, captivated by the rare display of emotional dominance in a space designed for entertainment rather than confrontation. The roots of the argument now came into sharper focus. The discussion had begun with the unfinished legacy of Denosia, a film Joaquin had once championed, a project he had left abruptly for reasons he had never publicly disclosed. The sudden exit, just days before filming, had caused chaos within the production. Pedro Pascal had eventually replaced him, and the project resumed years later. But the void left behind remained a sensitive topic. The mention on live television, even lightly framed, reopened the door to old frustrations. The casual framing of his departure, implying capriciousness or difficulty, had inadvertently struck a nerve, revealing the tension between public perception and personal truth. A subtle shift occurred as Joaquin, still standing, began to speak again. His voice calm but resonant, measured yet forceful. "I didn't leave because it was easy, and I didn't leave because I wanted to," he said, his words deliberate. "I left because it mattered to me that the work was honest, and honesty isn't always convenient for everyone else." The phrasing carried a quiet weight, a subtle but unmistakable indictment of those who had judged his actions without understanding the nuances of creative integrity. The audience felt the gravity, the tension, the sense of witnessing not only a personal defense but also an assertion of artistic principle. Jimmy, momentarily stunned, shifted in his seat, searching for a way to recover his usual humor, the tool that had allowed him to navigate countless tense moments with other guests, faltered in the face of Joaquin's composed intensity. There was no aggression, no shouting, only a presence that demanded acknowledgement. The subtle embarrassment was visible, a rare glimpse of vulnerability from a host who thrived on confidence and control. The audience noticed, of course, leaning in even closer, sensing that the narrative had shifted from playful dialogue to a powerful demonstration of personal authority and self-possession. As Joaquin returned to his seat, the energy in the studio remained charged. Every subtle gesture, the way he crossed his arms, the slight tilt of his head, The controlled exhalation communicated satisfaction at having regained the narrative. Jimmy attempted to continue the conversation, but the dynamic had irrevocably changed. The host, usually the conductor of the evening's energy, now had to navigate the powerful presence Joaquin had established. The conversation flowed differently now, measured and cautious, with the audience acutely aware that they had witnessed a rare triumph, a guest asserting control over not only the narrative, but also the atmosphere of a live studio. Outside the cameras, murmurs among the crew and production team reflected the unusual nature of the evening. Many commented on how the tension, though subtle at first, had escalated into a moment of quiet power and authority, leaving everyone present aware of the extraordinary display of composure and principle. The audience, meanwhile, was left with a memory that blurred the line between entertainment and drama. A vivid reminder of how, even in a space designed for jokes and performances, the truth of human emotion could assert itself with undeniable force. By the time the segment concluded, the sense of catharsis was palpable. Joaquin had not yelled, he had not stormed off, and yet he had delivered an undeniable, triumphant statement of agency. He had responded to years of mischaracterization, to the casual assumptions of others, and to the subtle provocations of the evening with composure, intelligence, and quiet power. In doing so, he had not only reclaimed his own narrative, but had also left the audience with a profound appreciation of the subtleties of human emotion, of artistic integrity, and of the unspoken tension that can exist beneath the bright lights of a talk show stage. The cameras continued to roll, capturing every small gesture, every fleeting expression. As the live audience remained riveted, Joaquin Phoenix, seated now, but radiating the calm authority of someone fully in control, had shifted the energy of the studio entirely. The warmth of the lights, which had once signaled a familiar late-night comfort, now highlighted the contours of tension and resolution, casting shadows that made each movement more significant. Jimmy Kimmel, for the first time that evening, seemed cautious, his usual playful energy tempered by the subtle authority Joaquin had asserted. The audience could sense it, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Would the host attempt to regain his footing, or would the conversation continue under Joaquin's quiet dominance? The discussion turned naturally, almost inevitably, toward the film itself. Without overt aggression, Joaquin elaborated on Denosia, not to justify his departure, but to emphasize the thought and care he had invested in the project. He spoke sparingly, his words carefully chosen, measured in tone, but rich with implication. Every phrase conveyed a meticulous attention to detail, a dedication to honesty, and a refusal to allow casual assumptions to dominate the narrative. The audience, following closely, could almost reconstruct the lost days of production, imagining the intense creative collaboration and the sudden collapse that had left everyone scrambling. Could anyone truly appreciate the pressure, the artistry, and the human stakes behind those decisions? That unspoken understanding lent Joaquin's words even greater weight. Jimmy, sensing the audience's engagement and the shift in tone, attempted to respond, but the words stumbled slightly. The charm and levity that usually carried him through interviews were no longer sufficient. For the first time in his career, he was being outmaneuvered, not with wit or aggression, but with the quiet power of presence, the force of integrity, and the undeniable authority of lived experience. The audience felt the subtle embarrassment, not as ridicule, but as a recognition of human vulnerability. A host confronting the limits of his usual control when faced with unassailable truth. Joaquin, recognizing the moment, allowed a subtle smile to appear, not in mockery, but in acknowledgement of the rare victory he had achieved. The audience, already leaning in, sensed the culmination of a tension that had been years in the making. This was not a victory of anger or spectacle. It was the triumph of composure, of intellect, and of moral and artistic conviction. The subtle, almost imperceptible humor that Joaquin allowed himself in that moment only added to the complexity of the scene. A reminder that mastery of one's presence does not preclude a touch of human warmth. The cameras captured everything's the small nods of approval from audience members, the fleeting gestures of the crew, the way Jimmy subtly adjusted his posture, and the calm, assertive stance of Joaquin. Each element contributed to the narrative unfolding in real time, a story of confrontation, clarification, and ultimate reclamation of agency. It was a moment that required no shouted words, no dramatic exits, yet resonated with a power far beyond ordinary television spectacle. The audience knew they were witnessing something rare, a subtle, quiet, but undeniable victory in the theater of human interaction. In the final minutes, Joaquin allowed the conversation to pivot away from Denoche. He spoke of future projects, of creative ambitions, and of the lessons learned from the past. Yet the residue of the confrontation remained, like a quiet undercurrent, shaping every glance, every pause, and every gesture. The audience was left with an appreciation, not only for the words spoken, but for the emotional intelligence and discipline that had defined Joaquin's response. How rare it is, they thought, To witness such a combination of poise, passion, and subtle defiance on a stage designed for entertainment, by the time the segment concluded, the sense of triumph was unmistakable. Joaquin had not yelled, stormed off, or sought spectacle for its own sake. Instead, he had navigated a charged situation with precision and dignity. Jimmy Kimmel, seasoned and experienced though he was, had been outmaneuvered by subtle authority, and the audience felt the full weight of that moment. The episode, which could have been remembered as a casual interview with light entertainment, would instead be remembered as a masterclass in presence, control, and reclaiming one's narrative. In a world of assumptions, whispers, and speculation, Joaquin Phoenix had quietly yet definitively set the record straight. As the lights dimmed slightly and the cameras pulled back, the studio was filled with an almost tangible sense of closure. The tension that had dominated the room for nearly the entire segment had softened, replaced by an atmosphere of quiet. Joaquin Phoenix, seated with calm authority, exuded a presence that spoke louder than any words could. He had walked into the conversation prepared, measured, and fully aware of the stakes, yet even in the heat of confrontation, he had maintained composure and control. The audience, both in the studio and at home, could feel the gravity of what had just occurred, a rare instance where authenticity and personal integrity overrode the usual rhythms of entertainment television. Jimmy Kimmel, for his part, had regained a measure of his usual charm by the close of the segment, but the subtle shift in energy remained unmistakable. The host's smile no longer carried its usual confidence. It had been tempered by the recognition that he had encountered a guest who refused to be trivialized, underestimated, or dismissed. The dynamic had changed irrevocably, and the episode would be replayed countless times. Dissected not for jokes or monologues, but for the intricate human drama that had unfolded. For the first time in many years of late-night interviews, a host had been subtly outmaneuvered, not by spectacle or shouting, but by presence, intention, and principle. Joaquin's final words were measured and calm. A brief reflection on artistic ambition and personal integrity. He spoke about the lessons learned, the experiences that shaped him, and the importance of staying true to one's creative vision. Every phrase was deliberate, every pause purposeful, and every glance loaded with the quiet authority that had defined the entire exchange. The audience, captivated from start to finish, was left with a profound sense of witnessing something rare, a moment of triumph, not fueled by confrontation alone, but by the mastery of self, the reclamation of narrative, and the courage to confront assumptions with composure rather than anger. As the segment wrapped, applause rippled through the studio, not for a joke, a gag, or an amusing anecdote, but for the demonstration of human integrity in a live, hyper-sure environment. The cameras captured the subtle smiles, the shared recognition among crew and audience, and the lingering energy that comes from witnessing someone reclaim their story with poise. For Joaquin Phoenix, the moment was more than symbolic. It was the culmination of years of dedication, frustration, and artistic commitment, all distilled into a few unforgettable minutes on stage. For Jimmy Kimmel, the experience offered a subtle lesson in humility, the reminder that even the most seasoned host could encounter a guest whose quiet authority and presence could transform an entire interview. The energy in the studio was no longer tense, but reflective, a shared acknowledgement of the power of authenticity. Viewers at home, replaying the clip, would not only be entertained, but inspired, recognizing that sometimes the most powerful moments are not loud or aggressive, but composed, deliberate, and emotionally intelligent. By the end of the episode, it was clear to everyone watching that this would be remembered not for jokes or commentary, but for the dramatic, emotional arc that had unfolded, a confrontation that began with subtle tension, escalated with carefully measured provocations, and concluded with a guest reclaiming control in the most masterful, composed manner imaginable. Joaquin Phoenix had demonstrated that even in the glittering world of late-night television, authenticity, composure, and self-assurance could outshine bravado, spectacle, and conventional charm. And if you made it all the way to the end, we want to hear from you. Did Jimmy push too far? Or did Joaquin Phoenix act appropriately? Let us know down in the comments. Tell us how you felt watching the tension unfold, and share your thoughts on this unforgettable confrontation. This was more than just a late-night segment. It was a masterclass in human emotion, artistic integrity, and the power of presence. And we want to know what you think about every moment of it.